Good morning, everyone. My name is John Smithin from York University, Toronto. I'm actually one of the speakers in this session, but I've been volunteered to be the monitor as well, which doesn't entail much, just keeping time, etc. So I will, the title of this session, lost it now. Lost it altogether. We'll start with Lance Taylor from the New School for Social Research, and his paper is Accounting, Distribution, Unstable Dynamics, and Fundamental Uncertainty. And 20 minutes, I think.
Okay, well, thank you, John. And thank you very much to CG and to INET for inviting me. Since the conference is about resolving dichotomies or something like that, I thought I would raise some issues that come out of standard macroeconomics, which may be relevant to try to jump over thresholds between different disciplines. And I picked 4 topics, really. One, accounting, which is going to be mostly national income accounting. Distribution, linked into accounting. Possibly unstable dynamics over the business cycle and in terms of climate change. And finally, fundamental uncertainty, which I think is the key point and the one I would like to emphasize the most, if I can make this thing work. Now, the current system of national accounts, national account systems go back to the mid-1600s, by the way, with Sir William Petty, and have been reinvented various times in various places over the succeeding centuries. But I would argue that the current form of national accounts more or less was implicit in the general theory and more or less explicit in a pamphlet that Keynes wrote in 1940 about how to pay for the war. And then they sort of were later, the how to pay for the war accounts were subsequently more or less formalized by a couple of young whippersnappers who later got Nobel Prizes, named Richard Stone and Mead. And one talks about the Stone-Mead accounts, but in fact, they're more like the Keynes accounts. Another thing that Stone did was to say that, we can put these accounts in the form of a matrix. And this first slide essentially gives you a very simple matrix representation of the accounts as they more or less exist. So the main thing I'd like to emphasize, you have row totals equal column totals, output uses, intermediates, which don't really figure in the national accounts up in, let's see, where's the pointer here? Is that, where's the laser pointer? Sorry, managed to forget it already. That one there. So there you have, can you see that? No, yeah, there you have intermediate, no. Well, it is unstable. I think we'll just forget about the laser pointer. But what you have then in the first row are uses of output. In the first column are sources of incomes. They sum to each other. Second row shows that wage income, transfers from the government equal wage income. Wages plus transfers equal wage income. Profits are then, and then they're spent going down the columns. There's a macro balance column saying that saving from wages, saving from profits, negative saving from government is equal to investment. And the whole thing adds up as a fairly simple system. Now, of course, you can have a much more complicated SAM, which is a representation, social accounting matrix, which is a representation of the US system for 2009. This is an early version that was worked out by a former student of mine named Nelson Barbosa, who's now more or less running Brazil, and who still finds time in his spare time to do accounting puzzles. And the thing I'd like to emphasize, a couple of things I'd like to emphasize. If you go down the government column, you see that there's a figure of 2100, that's $2,100 billion, which the government is transferring to households. At the same time, government is collecting taxes from everybody, and it also has some government spending in the very top. So what you see there is something like 2.5 trillion of transfers going out of a GDP of like 14 trillion. You see 2.5 trillion of transfers flowing through the government, collected in the form of taxes, paid out to households. You see massive government borrowing. And you also see more or less equal flows going through a financial system, which in one pink row there is collecting sort of $2 trillion in interest and is paying out an equal amount to households. So there are two major transfer flows in the US economy which are important to trace through, as I'll try to emphasize later on. I'll skip this slide and then go on to the next one, which shows something about an attempt to fit current US income flows by 7 groups of households, fit them, integrate them into the national accounts. So what this slide gives you is basically a fabrication of the US income distribution in 2009 by 7 income recipient groups, fitted to the national accounts, which are themselves, of course, a fabrication. So we have a fabrication squared, but which probably does illustrate something about how the income how the existing US income distribution hangs together. And here you see a representation of the income and outlay flows of those 7 income groups. If you look at the income for each group, the income flow is on the left, the outlay flow is on the right. If you look at the 2 bottom income groups, you'll see that the purple or the orangish areas show transfer income. So the bottom quintile gets roughly half its income from transfers. The next up quintile gets a good chunk of its income from transfers. And the blue area shows incomes from wages. And for the 2 bottom quintiles, the bottom 40% of the income distribution, this is CBO data, by the way. The 2 bottom quintiles get roughly half and half their income from wages and transfers. The spending column to the right for both of them is higher than the income column, so they have negative saving, which are the green areas sticking down below. Negative saving is built into the consumer budget surveys back to 1985 or something like that in the US, and it shows up rather strikingly in this diagram. If you go up to the very top, the top 1%, you'll see that their blue wage income flow is still fairly substantial. Top 1 or 2% obviously receive a good chunk of their income from wages. You get a bit further up, and you see major income flows from proprietors' income and from financial incomes. So that this transfer taking place through the financial system largely benefits the people at the top. The transfer taking place to the government largely benefits people at the bottom. And these are 2 sort of major components of the way the US distributive system hangs together. Notice the blue areas, the middle class, you could say, would be roughly the third, fourth, and fifth, and the third and fourth quintiles in the next 10%. That is roughly between the 40th percentile and 90th percentile. Wages are their major source of income, and but they're also and the transfer component goes down fairly dramatically. The line at the bottom shows that that blue line rising gradually shows post-tax income, post-tax mean income for the various income groups. Notice that it rises fairly steadily up to the top 9, up to the 91 to 99th percentile, and then shoots up very rapidly. So mean incomes by group rise fairly steadily and then really jump up at the top. Now, we plan to extend this data backwards in time until 1985, and that line will become less steep. But it's perfectly clear that the US income distribution represented in this fashion shows a high degree of inequality. One can also think about taxes. And the US tax system as it exists turns out to be fairly progressive in the sense that income taxes rise, total taxes rise at about the same rate as income up to the top 1%. And then the jump, if you compare income ratios between the top 1% and the bottom 20% to tax ratios, the top the income ratio, again, this is mean income, and we can't get medians out of the data, but mean will have to suffice. The mean income ratio is something like 45 between the top 1% and the bottom 20%. The mean tax ratio is something like 20%. So that the tax system in the US then is fairly progressive up to the top 1% and then becomes quite regressive. Notice also, by the way, these income figures don't include capital gains, which of course are a major source of income for the top 1%. Mitt Romney's famous 15% tax rate essentially is based on financial incomes, and the capital gains component is not included here. Here you see a fiscal position of the US in 2009 in terms of what I call fiscal units. A fiscal unit is a convenient, defined as $400 billion, is a convenient number to work with because it shows on the left that the top 1% are paying about 1 fiscal unit, the next 9% are paying about 1 fiscal unit, and the middle class is paying about $200 billion or half a fiscal unit. Again, the middle class is between the 40th and 90th percentile. The incomes on the social insurance contributions, on the other hand, are spread fairly equally across the distribution, and then total government income is 9. Of that 9, government spends 5 on transfers, 5 fiscal units, which go largely to the middle class and the bottom. They spend on interest, which goes to the top. Their current outlay exceeds the total income of 9. You throw on public investment, and the public sector borrowing requirement turns out to be something like 4 fiscal units in this system of accounts. And notice that if you're talking about sort of changing the tax system, you can take 1 fiscal unit, for example, from the top 1%. If you cut their taxes by that amount and try to do something with a balanced budget, then you would have to raise middle income taxes pretty substantially. You would have to cut social contributions fairly substantially. That is, rearranging the tax system will not be an easy thing to do. Tax expenditures in this system of accounts add up to something like a half or less of a fiscal unit. So even attacking tax expenditures fairly aggressively is not going to sort of, if you like, rebalance the budget. Let me break off on the accounting and switch rather quickly over to dynamics. The two things fit together, as I'll try to emphasize, and as I'll try to say in a moment. But what you have here is, there was a guy named Richard Goodwin, an American who was educated in somewhat dramatic fashion at Harvard, McCarthy, and started to teach in Cambridge. And he came up with a simple sort of dynamic cycle, which you can read out of Marx, using Lotka-Volterra equations. And basically what we have here is a simple predator-prey system. The two straight lines, are so-called null Kleins, which show combinations of the wage share and the output gap, which will hold, if you look at the null Klein for stable demand, they're combinations of as I say, of the wage share and the output gap, which will hold the output gap constant. The stable share, null Klein, shows combinations of the two variables, which will hold the share constant. The little arrows pointing to the null Klein show the way the variables are moving when you are away from the null Klein. And just one observation then, if you start up in the northwest corner with a fairly high wage share and a fairly low output and a fairly big output gap, negative output gap, the little arrows tell you that output will start to increase because it wants to get back toward the stable demand, which means that the share will start to fall, and so you get, in that sense, a cyclical adjustment between these two variables. You can do econometrics on these cycles. A couple of people have done that, and in individual country data for the US and also for Europe, the cycle tends to show up fairly clearly in the data. Now, another former student of mine named Kodrina Rada and a colleague out at the University of Utah have very recently estimated the same model for 24 OECD economies. And you get this huge scatter of points. If you look at trajectories within the data set, you'll see that they follow the Goodwin type cycle. So then you have the null Kleins. Now, the interesting thing, that little red line going down there shows that since around 1985, there's been a major shift in the null Kleins. That is, you could think of the null Kleins as giving you medium-term trade-offs. And what the econometrics is telling you is those medium-term trade-offs have shifted over time in the direction of a lower wage share and a lower level of output. Now, one could interpret that as, and you see the red line showing the trajectory of the equilibrium point. You could interpret that as saying that regressive income distribution policies, wage cutting, much more rapid wage, much slower wage increases than productivity increases, and at the same time fairly contractionary macro policy, have shifted the economies, these 24 economies, in a southwest direction. It seems to me that that's a fairly interesting political economy point, which one may want to, which I think we want to address a bit more in the future. One could also read that diagram, if you just look at the data, is saying that demand is in fact wage-led in the sense that lower wages mean a lower equilibrium point, higher wages are associated with a higher equilibrium point. But it seems to me that's kind of a misreading of the data because both of those curves have been shifting. Just quickly over another couple of examples of this kind of dynamics that one can read into national accounts. What you have here is a scheme that was invented by another Cambridge economist, Wynne Godley, which shows net borrowing for households, business, government, and foreign sectors. Net borrowing is investment minus saving. And if you have positive net borrowing, your investment exceeds your saving, your expenditure exceeds your income. If you have negative net borrowing, you're essentially sending resources toward the rest of the economy. Just a couple of things that are worth pointing out. One is that if you look at the northwest and southeast diagrams, you see a very rapid rise in household net borrowing beginning sometime around 1980. And in the southeast, you see a very rapid increase in the current account deficit, both of which reverse in 2009 with the crisis and the stimulus package. But the early trends were not sustainable. You can't have net borrowing levels have to sum to zero, and you can't have one shooting up and the other shooting down forever. So that's one instability that was already built into the U.S. system. You get a second instability, or a second aspect of it, which shows coming out of recession that household net borrowing tends to rise, which means basically that household investment goes up fairly rapidly compared to household saving. Residential investment goes up rapidly compared to household saving. And that's been a leading indicator for business cycles up to the present one. Now with the housing crisis, residential investment is just barely beginning to pick up, and that's been another major contributing factor to the depth of the recession.
Last 2 minutes.
Yep, okay. Here you see one more picture related to the crisis, which shows real household price index on the vertical axis, real debt on the horizontal axis. Real debt rose along again, this is a predator-prey system. The prey is housing prices, the predator is debt. Again, you get a rise, then you get a household price break. And notice that there's overshooting in the debt, which is characteristic of many financial cycles. And that was another contributing factor to the crisis. Let me skip over the greenhouse gas dynamics, which itself is fairly interesting, and maybe we can take it up in the questions. And just finally stop off with the notion of uncertainty, or fundamental uncertainty as it has come to be called. And if you begin at the bottom, you have Clausewitz, who spent his time talking about the fog of war and that kind of thing. You have Rumsfeld with his unknown unknowns. You have Jared Diamond, who can tell you all kinds of horror stories about ecological and environmental collapses, which were caused by the fact that people in various environmental contexts simply did not foresee the bad effects of the things we were doing. Now, this notion that we cannot think about what's going to happen in the future because it hasn't, we cannot know there are unknown unknowns in the future because there are things with our current knowledge that we can't possibly grasp. We couldn't grasp the ozone layer in an ecological example. Ben Bernanke, when he was talking about the Great Moderation around 2006, 2007, just didn't know he was going to be, could not imagine that he was going to be hit by a major crisis. There are unknown unknowns lurking out there. And this was picked up by economists like Frank Knight and Friedrich Hayek and Keynes. Keynes spent a fair bit of time in the 20s talking to Wittgenstein and Ramsey and Zrafa. One would have liked to have been on the fly on the wall of the room when they were discussing these issues. And one thing that Keynes emphasized is that under fundamental uncertainty, we can't really know what is ahead of us because we can't imagine the implications. If you go back to this diagram, everybody who was doing financial modeling up until about 2006 just assumed that housing prices were going to continue to rise. That was built into all the evaluation models. That was what Keynes called a convention. He said that given uncertainty about the future, we fall back on conventions, and that's related to Wittgenstein's theory of knowledge, which says knowledge is a social process. But Keynes had a much more conjunctural notion in mind that given fundamental uncertainty, we rely on conventions, and those conventions can last for a long time. But then they can all of a sudden fall apart, and which is, in a way, what happened in 2007 and thereafter. Well, so thank you very much, and I hope this adds to the, oh, I should also, by the way, add one other thing, that all this draws upon a lot of people who have gone through the New School over the last 8 or 10 years and have made major contributions. And also thanks to the Center for Economic Policy Analysis at the New School and to INET. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lance. And now I'd like to introduce Judy Klein from Baldwin College, who will announce her own title, I think. It's a good one.
It's Mary Baldwin College. I'm a professor of economics there. What I want to talk about today is the militarized zone between theory and practice in economics, focusing on World War II and the Cold War. And I'm going to cover several dichotomies, in this history. And my argument is that military planning contracts valorize, put a premium on applied, practical, normative, prescriptive economics, and that this practice for military clients led to new models, new modeling strategies that fed back into a technical revolution in economics with new modeling strategies that led to some erosion of boundaries, like in some sense between micro and macro, but yet in itself erected additional boundaries or dichotomies between economics and the economy, and new ones between theory and practice there. So what I'm building up to is an explanation for how we ended up with a macroeconomic theory in which agents were modeled as a collection of individual decision roles. And you get the invisible hand being replaced, as Lucas and Stokey and Prescott called it, the benevolent social planner. And you get a communism of models, as Sargent described it, and recursive dynamics with uncertainty, and a macro monoculture of modeling strategy there. So I'm going to, and what you get coming out of World War II and the Cold War in terms of military, US military research, is you get common features of mathematical protocols. The solution had to be in a rule of action. And computability was essential. There had to be effective numerical solutions. So approximate solutions were preferred to exact solutions. The military was not interested in existence and uniqueness theorems. They wanted numerical solutions computed very quickly. And you get an allocation criterion of maximizing gain or minimizing loss. Often that meant maximizing damage to the enemy or minimizing your own losses. You got a need for realism in the models. There had to be an incorporation of uncertainty and a sequential, conditional, multi-stage decision process. So I'm going to start in World War II with an example, and I'm going to briefly go through this pretty quickly and then focus on the Cold War. But you got the example I want to start with is sequential analysis, where Captain Schuyler, who was head of the research division of the US Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, and he was testing out guns, two guns, to see whether a new gun was superior to the old gun. And he put the question to the statistical research group at Columbia University, which was a part of the applied mathematics panel, which was part of the National Defense Research Committee. In 1943, he put the question asking them, how could we statistically determine the superiority of the new gun over the old, and how many trials would it take? Alan Wallace, as he's described in his own personal history, answered back with this memo in 1943, statistical analysis of double dichotomies, very appropriate to this conference there. But essentially, he argued that it would take simultaneously firing of the two guns 3,700 times. So in all, using up scarce ordnance for 7,400 firings. And Schuyler responded back that that was too much. They could not waste that scarce ordnance. He also said that what they needed for the unskilled inspectors in the field were rules of action, and particularly graphical templates, so that, and he used the example of the statistical quality control chart that the inspectors had been using for sampling inspection, and he wanted something similar to that, where the inspector would place decisions on the graph and then make a decision based on that. Well, the answer came when the SRG handed the problem over to Abraham Wald. He answered back with a very ingenious log probability ratio test, lots of mathematics, and the military said, no, we need a rule of action. We cannot assume that the inspector understands probability theory. We need a decision rule. It's all based on rules in the military. So what you got were the applied mathematicians building on what the theorem manager Wald had designed. So George Stigler, Milton Friedman, Alan Wallace worked on taking Wald's mathematical theory and breaking it down into steps for a hierarchy within the military, so that these steps were designed for the officers designing the graphical templates to put the log probability ratio test into a rule form there. And so, and they also designed nomograms. So Friedman, Stigler, in much younger days than that photo showed, in the 1940s, were designing these nomograms so that you could have effective computation very quickly of these new graphical templates. So you end up with the person, the enlisted personnel would be, I think I've run into the same problem that Lance has with that. But if you go to the dotted line starting at the lower left hand of the graph, you can see that with each firing, you get the simultaneous firing of the old and new gun. With each firing, they plot out whether the old or the new gun was superior in that paired firing. And you keep on plotting out. As long as you're in that white boundary region between the two boundaries, you keep on observing. And once you cross, your plotted line crosses one of those lines into the shaded area, then your decision has been made. So it was a graphical decision rule that minimized the sample size for the military and saved considerably on scarce ordnance there. And it was a recursive protocol that achieved this there. So what you ended up with also was a cognitive division of labor in the model design process that showed up in many other forms, similar or identical form, but many other examples during World War II and the Cold War there, because what you needed to get to was a handbook-ready decision rule that could be implemented by unskilled labor there. What I want to focus on, though, is a Cold War example looking at dynamic programming and quadratic, and then building particularly on the quadratic cost formulation. So I'm starting with the RAND Corporation with Richard Bellman's work on dynamic programming, and then looking at what happened at the Carnegie Institute of Technology as they were applying this for a Navy project there. And so with the Cold War, you've got obviously the battle between the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, and a big problem at the beginning that a lot of applied mathematicians like Bellman were working on is the allocation process of scarce nuclear bombs. The US emerged from World War II with very few nuclear bombs left after the two that they used during the war. How do you allocate this among potential targets in the Soviet Union? So you get very polar-based maps there. You know, so many maps are all based around the North Pole, very polar-centric maps. But the task facing RAND was to decide a multi-stage allocation process for deciding where to send your nuclear weapons there. You'll also see that similar polar-based map on this diagram that was at the beginning of the slides, which is from the underground base of the Strategic Air Command in Nebraska, and this is a 1960 or late 50s photo for that. That's where the decisions would be made about where to send the bombs. So what Richard Bellman, the first project he worked on for his protocol that he called dynamic programming, was this allocation for nuclear weapons. And he built on Wald's work of sequential analysis. He set up his model to maximize damage to the enemy and decide at each stage which target do you send that scarce atomic material to. Now, in his published material, such as in Econometrica, he did not call it a strategic bombing model. He called it his gold mining equation model. So you have a delicate gold mining machine trying to decide which gold mine to go to, mine A or mine B. But it was the same protocol. But the important thing about it is it was recursive optimization. It was maximizing expected damage to the enemy, or maximizing the gold that you mined. And very important to my focus is he saw a solution. The solution was a rule. And he realized from Wald's work, from Kenneth Arrow's work for the military and optimal inventory control, that the mathematical solutions to be in the form of rules of action there. So you end up at the bottom with his policy rule for making this decision between the two gold mines or the two targets there. And he generalized this to be, he called this new space that mathematics was going into policy space or strategy space. And he focused not on approaching the mathematical problem by looking at the maximization and solving for that, but solving for the optimal rule that would get you the maximum damage to the enemy. So approximations in policy space. Dynamic programming took a dramatic turn with the events in October 1957 and the Soviet launch of a moon, a satellite. There. And you had one of the many changes in the US, you had the highest frequency of per capita oscilloscope watching that we've ever seen, because in the first few weeks, the only visual manifestation of this demonstration of technological superiority of the Soviet Union was in the oscilloscope, picking up the radio signals from Sputnik. Beaming there. Now, with echoes back to Emma Rothschild's talk last night, you got the Soviets seeing this very much as proof that the October Revolution worked, and this represented the technological superiority coming from socialism there. And of course, this led to dramatic changes on the American side, and the American military approached this achievement by the centrally planned economy by they themselves doing a lot more planning, and the space race was on. Now, what Richard Bellman did and what a lot of Rand Corporation researchers who were working for the Air Force did was to focus on optimal trajectory problems there. So how Bellman saw the optimal trajectory problem within this framework of dynamic programming that he had developed for stochastic allocation processes is that you would have an adaptive heuristic, a way of correcting your velocity there. So you can see it like a pursuit curve going after a rabbit, and this is Bellman's drawing, that the old calculus of variations approach would give you the pursuit curve ahead of time as a locus of point. It would be a schedule, a pre-planned schedule. And what Bellman was arguing was for approximations in policy space. So what you do at various points in that pursuit is assess what your state is, and from that state, you use the policy rule from dynamic programming to give you the transition, and it builds up a tangent line to get to that rabbit. And so you can see your pursuit curve at the end of that pursuit would be a locus of tangents. And this was his dual approach of doing approximations in policy space there. And to give you some example is this computer of data going to the moon. And you assess periodically, the spaceship would assess its state from observations on two heavenly bodies there. And there would need to be a correction to get you back onto the optimal trajectory there. But you had to minimize fuel. So it was an optimization with a fuel minimization because the fuel that the spaceship could take once it was past the orbit of the Earth was very limited there. But there was also nested in this a minimization of computational resources. And to give you some idea of this big problem, this is from 1957. You have a computer that stores 5 megabytes of data, weighs a ton. And this is the computer that was on the spaceship. That was designed for the late 50s, early 1960s there. So you had to have very effective computational protocol for that. And from that, we get Kalman's filter. Kalman was working for the Air Force at the Martin Aircraft Company, and he designed, building on Bellman's work on optimal trajectories and control, and Bellman's notion that control is a function of state, designed his Kalman filter protocol. Now, what I want to skip ahead is how this fed into work at the Carnegie Institute of Technology in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and the business school there. And the business school, the Graduate School of Industrial Administration, got 2 major research planning contracts. The first was from the Air Force, Project Scoop, and the other was from the Office of Naval Research. And these one, the Office of Naval Research one lasted until 1962, and it funded a lot of research at the Carnegie Institute there. So for the Office of Naval Research project, Holt, Modigliani, Muth, and Simon worked on the paint factory problem, where uncertainty became their common bond. They had to forecast demand for paint, and from that had to smooth out the production process so that costs could be kept at a minimum, the inventory and the employment scheduling. So it was production planning, scheduling planning. They got the first computer, the graduate school there, at the Carnegie Institute, but not until 1956. So until then, they had to work with they had to work with desktop calculators. And so what you end up is their realization that when they were applying Bellman's dynamic programming to this production planning thing, if they used their cost minimization function, which took a quadratic form, then you could forget the probability distribution, focus just on the expected average value that they got by using a adaptive expectations formula there. And that led to very effective computation on the calculators. But notice that the quadratic form is just an approximation for the U-shaped cost curves there. And, but within certain regions, it would work quite effectively there. And that yielded, with that quadratic cost function in dynamic programming, it yielded a linear decision rule for the paint factory. And what you get is this notion from Simon and Holt and those working on it that there was no gulf between theory and practice. Practice fed back into theory and, you know, determined your model for you as you were facing these constraints. And Simon stepped back from this and said, well, as a normative model maker, we are having to deal with limited computational resources. Therefore, as model makers in positive economics, modeling consumers and entrepreneurs as their own model makers, we have to assume limited computational resources there. So what he did was step back, take a meta-modeling view, and from that, we get his notions of bounded rationality. And, you know, a similar visual diagram to the one that they drew for the quadratic cost approximation, how in a chess game, you have your stepped utility curve approximation rather than that smooth function there. And we have to replace the goal of maximizing the satisficing. Well, the junior colleague on that team, John Muth, totally bought into Simon's idea of this stepping back, thinking about model makers and how they had to minimize computational resources, and said, well, therefore, why don't we just simplify things by assuming that the quickest way to get expected prices was to, you know, take the equilibrium prices that the economists were telling us would be what would be the outcome there. And he tested out his expected rational expectations hypothesis against the data from the cobweb, the hog cycle, and compared it with Nurlov's adaptive expectations model there. Okay, thank you. Now, there's a to and fro between Muth and Simon in this. You know, Muth is saying, you know, we're doing this for simplification, limiting, you know, working with limited computational resources. That's in response to Simon's bounded rationality. Simon then responds with another definition of rationality, procedural rationality, and starts to develop a theory in the 1970s of modeling strategy and procedural rationality, the rationality of the decision-making process that's done when you have to, it's a rationality for those with scarce computational resources there. But what's also happening is Lucas in 1966 in a working paper at the Carnegie Institute builds on Muth's work, first in a micro setting, and then, as we know, taking that on to macroeconomics there. And what I want to end with is comparing what happened in economics with what was happening in control engineering. And one thing, though, I'll say that, you know, this militarized zone, this boundary region, as Norbert Wiener, who was working in the same National Research Defense Committee projects during World War II observed, can be very fruitful. It leads to major refraction, mass attack on old divisions of labor. And so it was very fruitful for economics because we got out of that this notion that the individual is modeled, is a collection of decision rules. Planning becomes very important as the invisible hand. You get two very abiding modeling strategies, but, and this is what I want to end it with, you get this monoculture of modeling strategy there. This was a technical revolution. The rational expectations theorists very much see it as that there. And there was a similar turn in mathematical programming, where you got the algorithmic track going much more toward a mathematical abstract track. And also with, you can see this quotation from Lucas saying, you know, there's been a lot of confusion because rational expectations is not a property of consumers. It is a property of models there. And a very similar statement from Kalman on control engineering, that control theory, because what's happening after the Kalman filter, so forth, is control engineering, the model making, is with the guide towards synthesis. It's very much a normative approach there, and you're just dealing with the properties of observability, controllability of the models, not the real world phenomena. However, okay, yes, and I think that's the last slide there. Well, this was an observation that I don't have time to go over, but so you got this modeling turn with modeling strategy becoming so important in these other fields. But what is unusual about economics is that it didn't go off on its own or have its own part of a department. It really became the dominant way in which we approach macroeconomics. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Judy. The actual title of our session is The Ideas of Economics Against the Challenges of Our Time. And I think that was an example of ideas from outside economics taking over economics and being against the challenges of our time. When I was teaching, advanced macro in graduate school, I used to teach the Bellman equation on the one hand, and the Pontiagrian, if I may have mispronounced it, equation on the other. Naturally, and in my opinion quite rightly so, the students would complain. Why are we doing this stuff? And I would say something like, oh, come on, this is not rocket science. And then there would be a pause, and I would come back and say, oh, yeah, well, of course it is rocket science, actually. Nothing to do with economics whatsoever. The title which I have thought up to fit in with this session title, and you'll see where I got this in a moment, I've called it Illusion and Delusion in Mainstream Neoclassical Economics. And if I just advance the thing. And this is where the title came from. The relevant studies I'd like to draw your attention to is one by the late Dudley Dillard from 1988, which was entitled The Barter Illusion in Classical and Neoclassical Economics. That became quite a famous article, actually. The late James Tobin, towards the end of his life, put forward a collection of papers which Tobin, thought were the most significant ones in macroeconomics. And lo and behold, this paper from the Eastern Economic Journal, I think it was the lead article, if I remember rightly, in that collection which Tobin put forward. More recently, John King has come out with a book entitled The Micro Foundations Delusion, a Metaphor and Dogma in the History of Macroeconomics, which is just out. So obviously that's where the illusion and the delusion come from. Another study, which is a PhD thesis recently defended and completed by Mendoza España, 3 essays on money, credit, and philosophy, a realist approach per totam viam, all the way to monetary science. So that was a very successful dissertation in economics, by the way, which was successfully defended. And then finally, myself, this is a paper which is forthcoming in a volume edited by Jeff Harcourt and Jocelyn Pixley in Australia, requirements of a philosophy of money and finance. And basically, this talk is based on the latter. So the illusion. No, let's just go on to the. Yeah. Now, this is the comment which I made on. I was going to say the dust jacket of John King's book, but they don't have dust jackets anymore. Like, on the back of John King's book, I said a generation ago, Dudley Dillard wrote a famous article on the barter illusion in classical and neoclassical economics. I mean, that's obviously the idea that economic activity can be treated as if it were just a question of barter exchange. And John King has gone a step further and has written about the micro-foundations delusion. The illusion, the barter illusion has been with us for a very long time. The delusion, the micro-foundations delusion, is of a more recent vintage. Together, they have blocked a basic understanding of macroeconomic and monetary phenomena at a time when they are most urgently needed. So, yes, I mean, ideas of economics against the challenges of our time. Oh. But I think it's interesting to inquire specifically what did John King find delusional? And he was quite specific, actually. He mentioned the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, the DSGE model, which we all know. And also, this is a coinage of his own, the rare individual, indeed you might say the non-existent individual, the rational agent with the representative agent with rational expectations. I mean, as a good Keynesian, I'm okay with the dynamic. Obviously, the stochastic has to go and the general equilibrium has to go. But the point is that I'm trying to make, like he's specifically criticizing certain trends, the micro-foundations literature within macroeconomics. What this does not imply, it seems to me, it does not imply that a complete monetary theory can do without all of these issues. Pricing theory, cost theory, theory of value, theory of the firm. So King specifically says, I don't wish to replace the micro foundations of macroeconomics with the macro foundations of microeconomics. I'm not 100% in agreement with that statement, but that's what John King said. The question really is, to what extent is textbook microeconomics at all levels an adequate treatment, and can it really be foundational in any serious sense? That's the question. How to do things otherwise? Well, I've often argued in favor of an interdisciplinary approach to issues of the economy, business, money, finance, and so forth. And I have argued that such an approach, if it's to be effective, would need to comprise or need to include each of these disciplines, if that's the right word, academic disciplines, and actually more or less in the precise order that you see here. First of all, now, I'm very fortunate that the term ontology was introduced last night, so we're already down that road. First of all, one would need to develop a realist social ontology. That is to say, the ontology of specifically social institutions and social facts, including all such things as business firms, money, banks, governments, the state, if you will, and so on. And a crucial point to notice is that realist ontology, it's certainly realist, but it's a different ontology from the ontology of physical facts, the so-called brute facts, which are presumably studied in natural science. Somebody yesterday said, and it's a common enough metaphor, we should think of money like electricity, I think it was, or something, or we should think of money like oil lubricating the machinery. No, money is a social institution, and it does its work. It has a different nature of being, so to speak, than the physical sciences. So I think that's an important point. The next one would be economic sociology, which I interpret as the study of the specific social institutions in a given socio-economic system. For example, Max Weber talked about the study of the method of enterprise, in short, capitalism, right? And his idea was to study the specific social institutions which would lead to the development of a capitalist economic system. Then we come to monetary macroeconomics, which obviously is my field, and I would say that's the most important technical field of economics. And the thing to notice there is the qualifier monetary. Macroeconomics is monetary economics, nothing more, nothing less, as I say in the paper. Then the final one is political economy, and that should be dealing with the sort of questions that we've already addressed to some extent in this conference so far, questions of policy and governments, comparative economic systems, notions of equity, income, and wealth distribution, etc. Now, there's an interesting correspondence, I think, with the traditional branches of philosophy. If you think of the traditional branches of philosophy as being ontology, epistemology, ethics, politics, then obviously our realist social ontology corresponds to ontology. The economic sociology and the monetary macroeconomics are, as I perceive them, they are epistemologies. They're ways of finding out stuff, ways of obtaining knowledge about things in and of themselves. So they're both, they comprise an epistemology. And then finally, obviously, ethics and politics, the philosophical term ethics and the philosophical term politics correspond to political economy. Now, there are a number of questions arising from this scheme, and obviously I won't be able to discuss all of them. These are three which are sort of which need to be discussed, but not the main point of this talk. I mean, the first one, though, I just briefly say, obviously, the first question that arises is, where is Zimmel's notion of the two boundaries of the philosophical domain? Well, the short answer is that they aren't there. Like, the argument has a philosophical character throughout. You know, there are, like, the whole argument has a philosophical character throughout. There's the issue of what kind of knowledge is sought. There's a Greek term, episteme, which is usually translated as scientific knowledge. That's misleading, though, in the context of money and finance for the cultural reasons which have actually already been, explored in this context. It would be better to say something like understanding the principles of things there, rather than scientific knowledge per se. Technical knowledge, well, technical knowledge in the business school context would be the functional courses, things like accounting and finance and, marketing, I suppose, and so forth. Practical knowledge, I have in mind something as simple as being able to stagger across to a computer, log on, connect to the internet, and then sell short. Do it yourself in that sense. That's what I would perceive of as practical knowledge in the monetary and financial context. And as I was always trying to say to my business students, what we must surely be interested in the university context is the first of the two, episteme. Like, it's not much use knowing how complicated derivatives work or having a PhD in finance and so forth if one does not understand the basic principles of money and credit. Another issue is the exact status of ethics, and I just cryptically said CF values in Weber's sense rather than the term value in Marx's sense. The thing I'm interested in there is where does ethics actually come in the list of things? Well, it comes, after we've looked at the ontological and epistemological, after we've made a decision on ontological questions and epistemological questions. You cannot sensibly talk about ethics unless you have a knowledge of the environment, in which you're dealing with. So that's all I wanted to mention there. Obviously that's a broad topic. So the main point, though, for our present purposes, is what has happened. This is the ideas of economics against the challenges of our time. What has happened to neoclassical microeconomics? That whole paradigm. Now, yesterday we did have a number of papers talking about different methodologies within the general paradigm of neoclassical microeconomics, but they don't reject the fundamental premises. For example, the barter illusion. Where is neoclassical microeconomics? Well, nowhere, actually. It does not appear explicitly. I would say that's okay as soon as it's realized that the term economic sociology already includes such things as the study of firms, the study of governance and governance, and the study of pricing, and the study of market structure, etc., etc. So economic sociology is standing in there for the neoclassical microeconomics. However, it does put the market in its place, so to speak, in the broader social order, rather than being the only thing discussed, and most certainly it cannot be the first thing discussed, micro foundations. It can't be the first thing that's discussed. I just want to elaborate on that point a little bit. This is what's known as an iterative sequence. It's a term taken from analytical philosophy, and I reference Searle's book, Making the Social World, the Structure of Human Civilization. Really, all that iteration means is that apparently simple social institutions, beginning essentially with what Searle would call a speech act, right, build on one another in some sort of logical sequence, like, X counts as Y in context C, and so there's a logical order. One institution builds on another, and you can build up a social structure of bewildering complexity from the basic underpinnings. And this, I would say, is an iterative sequence as applied to economic sociology. Now, the classic economic sociologists did not do this. Someone like Weber would say, oh, what are the conditions of existence of modern capitalism, as he called it? And he would then list a bunch of conditions, free markets, rational accounting, but there was no order. Like there were about, Weber in fact did put in 6 different conditions in the general economic history, but there was no sense in which the one institution built on the other institutions. And I think this is the way that it should build. First of all, and this goes back to the question that I asked last night at the dinner speech, which I asked, can markets exist without the state? Answer, obviously, no. The first thing that you need is a political settlement of some kind. Now, I don't think that what happened last week in the United States is in any sense a settlement. On the contrary, I think it just, as was said last night, it just continues the same discussion that have been going on. What I have in mind is something like the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, or something like the decisive change in political direction that took place in China in the 1980s and culminated in their growth. Then, once you have the state, you have money. And money, I don't need to explain that to many of the people in the audience, but money means everything which is included under that rubric. We're not just talking about notes and coins. Money there would need to be a unit of account, a means of payment, not medium of exchange. There would need to be secure credit relations, and there would need to be a mechanism of credit creation, the banking system, in short. Because without credit creation, without someone somewhere going into debt, there can be no profits for others. Next is private property in the legal sense, not just mere possession, not just on the top of the hill and I control that. I mean, it would mean exactly all the legal sense, issuing liens, encumbering the property and so forth. What's interesting here is that this is controversial. There's a group called property theorists who argue that the property theorists argue that you must have property, the concept of property must exist before money. Weber was absolutely convinced of the opposite, and there's a phrase from Weber that money is the father of private property. And then obviously, once we've got those institutions, we've got markets, and okay, they serve the allocative issue, but really and truly, what is a market? Well, if you have a system of provisioning which entails the pursuit of, profits denominated in money terms, then a market must be a virtual or real place where you can sell stuff. That seems to me to be the ultimate thing, where the profits can be realized, in short. That's the role of markets. And then, of course, finally, much to the chagrin of my business students, they would like to start with the entrepreneur as the foundation of all things. Finally, only when you have all those social institutions in place can you have this concept of entrepreneurial business, as I call it. So I'm probably done with time. Yeah, I'm done with time, so that's it. Thank you. Oh, and as in my moderator role, I suppose we now have questions. So if we, yes, I can see one there, one there, one there.
Hi, I'm Katerina Pistor from Columbia Law School. What I found intriguing by about all three presentations is the historical contingencies of our models and how we think about the world, but also of the world that we're looking at. So just starting with the last, I mean, I'm very intrigued by sort of the Weberian approach here, but I also think we have to specify which economies and what historical periods we're analyzing. So we're basically doing modern capitalism or financial capitalism today, and maybe some of the insights, including Weber's insights about where money came from like 3,000 years earlier, are less relevant today than they might have been, because they're different institutionally constituted today than they would have been in other times. What I found striking about the other presentations is how much our thinking about the economy is formed also by historically contingencies, and yet we take these models to generalize today, but also to generalize backwards and think that we have a general theory. So the question is, where are we now with general theories about the economy and the world? Thank you.
Shall we take a list of questions, and then answer, and then each answer, or?
I think that makes more sense.
Yeah. So can we take the next couple of questions? Yeah.
I'm Perry Merling. So I want to just draw some connections between Judy Klein's and Lance Taylor's presentations and then ask a question about this. It seems to me that the maybe somewhat hidden story underneath Lance's is also that national income accounting is a protocol of war. That the how to win the war, how to pay for the war, I think it is, Keynes' famous newspaper article, actually. I often teach Keynes starting there, because it's a lot clearer than the general theory. But the notion of using the state basically to mobilize resources to fight the enemy, okay, gets transmuted into using the state to mobilize resources to fight the business cycle or something like this. So protocol of war is sort of in both places. I find it very, it's useful, I don't know, and so here I'm going to, I guess, ask for your reaction. So we know where these things came from, and it seems that both of you are saying that after, this is where they came from, but then they had life of their own. They moved into economics, and they kind of had a self-perpetuating quality to themselves, which, now here comes the argument part, which shaped what could and could not be said in economics in a way, because these are not neutral techniques. They're methods that shape what can be seen and what cannot be seen. So my question for you, these protocols of war from 1945, how adequate are they for our time?
And so if we take another question, and then perhaps we'll pause and...
Yeah, so my name is Oscar Torvason. I'm a PhD student here from the Young Scholar. I wanted to throw in, just under the title of both the session and the conference, an idea that I got during all the three lectures about maybe a false dichotomy we have between savings and investment. From the national accounts in the first lecture, where investment in residentials and even the negative savings of the last quarter, people buying house can actually see it when they are amortizing their loans as a saving put into the building. instead of seeing it as an investment. So I also connected to the last slide of the last lecture of the structure of the, so your thoughts on that, thanks.
Yeah. So shall we answer this and then take another group?
Okay.
Judy, would you like to?
Well, with regards to the first query, I thought it was interesting that the rational expectations theorists that are taking up this recursive macro dynamics and using the dynamic programming model and the Kalman filter, they very much acknowledged this was a technical revolution, but they had seen actually Keynesian economics as a technical revolution. And they very much qualified that by saying it's Keynesian economics that was practiced in the US. So they actually said much less with regards to Keynes' general theory. But it was one technical revolution at battle with another within that context as they saw it. And I think the question that we have to face as economists is to what extent should this technical revolution have dominated in the way that it had in macroeconomics, to the point that is it sort of barriers to entry to a profession in terms of building up this technical expertise, and I think that brings in an interesting sociological perspective on the profession, that this became so dominant, that modeling strategy became the dominant driving force for the development of what we're calling economic theory there. And I think with regards to Perry's argument, I think they did take on a life of their own, and I saw that as I tried to make the point near the end, that it also, that modeling strategy and that meta-modeling, that stepping away from modeling and thinking about modeling itself, that Simon initiated at the Carnegie Group, that is a very similar thing was done in other branches. And you saw it much earlier on with probability theory becoming divorced, from its applications there. And again, to me, the striking thing is that it took so much of journal space and departmental space allocations focusing on the technical revolutions. And your question, you ended with how adequate, is that what your question was, Perry?
For today.
Well, I would say that what we're seeing is that it is inadequate. I think where we have been aided by both the Keynesian theory and the technical revolution that happened after the war in macroeconomics, both technical revolutions, is that we're much more prepared for incorporating uncertainty. So I think that there are certain advantages for it, but I think that it is inadequate and that we've got to get beyond that. And I'm grateful for INET and CG for spurring that interest to go beyond. And perhaps my colleagues can answer that much further.
Well, let me try to respond to various aspects of the three questions. Beginning with the last one, the important thing to recognize if you're talking about macroeconomics in any given year, any given point in time, is that it is really about flows. I mean, I'm getting Social Security, not because I contributed to Social Security while I was still working. I'm getting Social Security because somebody's paying a tax, which is being transferred to me. So you have to have flow transactions in the macroeconomy. So if, as you come out of a business cycle, a house residential investment jumps up, if in fact it does do so, if that exceeds saving, then that's a flow of resources which is adding, that's a flow of spending which is adding to effective demand. And that's what's driving the system in the short run. Now, the things may be amortized over time. That's, in a way, what stock flow consistent modeling is about, although you can get into big messes there. But the point is, at least right now, the flows are what matter. With regard to the first question, theory obviously has to be based on institutions. The general theory is the theory of London financial capitalism in the 1930s. And we no longer live in that world, although there are some aspects of it that carry over. And you can't read the general theory and figure out what to do about the financial crisis in any detail. What you can recognize is that what Keynes saw as the role of conventions and how that supports existing transactions in the business sector is very important. And that still is relevant. Now, Keynes in the general theory is sort of tried to talk about pharaonic Egypt and other ancient societies in terms of what he was writing. And Joan Robinson, when she read that part of the book, said she thought he was nuts, and he was. You have to think of the historical context. Perry's question, as usual, was very interesting. I guess I would respond in the following way, that yes, in How to Pay for the War, which did come out originally in The Guardian, Keynes was trying to establish a role for the state as a mobilizer of resources, as a generator of employment, et cetera, which did not really figure in the previous iterations on national accounts. That is, Colin Clark and certainly Simon Kuznets wanted a much more limited role of the state to be built into the system, and Keynes made that decision, I think, for politically obvious reasons, and that certainly has influenced our current perceptions today. As far as the other revolution goes, well, that's when macroeconomics went off the rails, really. Sort of importing dynamic programming and Kalman filtering and the Pontryagin maximum principle into macro just really shot things completely. People believed in these models. The technical prowess of finance theory had a lot to do with supporting the financial crisis, and that also came out of that same basic tradition. And you know, it was a horrible, horrible mistake, at least among the professional economists.
Thank you. I mean, I agree very much with your last point, by the way. So I want to respond, first of all, to this idea about, yes, we have to think of a specific mode of production, if you like, or a specific economy that we're studying. And I agree 100% with that. Robert Heilbronner always used to talk about the traditional economy, the command economy, and then the market economy. A combination of me and my students have argued that there should be two more. There's another one that's discussed, you know, the Crusoe economy, right? Which is just one individual on a deserted island doing the best he or she can. And an amazing amount of economic theory is devoted to that, which is not social science at all. Now, within the market economy, I think it's crucially important to distinguish, as did Keynes, between an economy which is either a barter exchange economy or one which includes money in a minimal fashion, you know, as a numeraire, and an economy in which money is an essential part of the, you know, production process. And that, I would suggest, that's Weber's method of enterprise. And so obviously the sort of macroeconomics that I would be interested in is a macroeconomics for the method of enterprise of the current day. As for the historical evolution of money, again, I think the sociological and the philosophical approach would downplay historical origins. They would try to look at what these social institutions are in fact. A bond, for example, is a bond. And the technical changes don't seem to me, there's one thing I say to my students, the technical changes that we use computers and so on and so forth that would not faze Lorenzo de' Medici. It wouldn't faze Bagehot, or any of these other past discussers of financial crisis. There was something else on investment and savings, and of course this long-standing thing about do savings come first or do investments come first. We can translate that into the financial sector in two simple questions. And when I'm, as I often unfortunately have to, when I'm examining finance PhD thesis, I always ask them at the end, often in banking, do loans make deposits or do deposits make loans? I think we all know what the right answer is. I'll session wrap up. But I think you can also guess what the majority of people, after studying the subject for 7 or 8 years, come up with. I'm going to thank everyone now. We're out of time. Sorry, no more time for questions. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for providing such an interesting session. Thank you.